Forget champagne, grapes, and fireworks. If you think your hangover this January 1st is going to be bad, it's because you didn't experience the New Year's celebration in the Middle Ages. You probably have the image of a medieval church as a boring, silent, and dark place, right? Well, erase that from your mind. Because on January 1st, the Catholic Church, that institution obsessed with order, allowed the wildest, most grotesque, and blasphemous party in all of history. And it wasn't in a secret speakeasy. It was right on top of the high altar. Get ready, because today we are diving headfirst into the real Middle Ages, the raw reality that Disney tried to show us in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but had to sanitize because the historical truth was too dirty for a children's movie. We are talking about the Festum Fatuorum, or the Feast of Fools. And be careful, because this name wasn't a metaphor. For a few days, usually in late December, the church, that institution obsessed with order, threw the doors wide open to absolute chaos. Literally, the world was allowed to turn upside down inside the temple walls. To understand why this happened, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a medieval subdeacon. Imagine you are a young cleric, the lowest on the totem pole. You've spent the entire year obeying orders, staying silent, praying in the freezing cold, eating poorly, and enduring the scolding of the older priests who hold all the power. Life is hard, rigid, and boring. But then, late December arrives, and suddenly, the rules vanish. The hierarchy is inverted. In the Feast of Fools, the goal was to ritually humiliate the powerful and elevate the humble. They base this on a very literal interpretation of a Bible passage that says, "He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly." And boy, did they take that literally. It all started with the election of the Bishop of Fools. And who was this character? Well, they didn't choose the wisest or the most pious. They chose the most ridiculous guy, the group's jester, or the clumsiest subdeacon. They dressed him in the real bishop's sacred robes, sometimes wearing them inside out or backwards, and gave him a staff made of twisted branches or animal bones. They sat him on the cathedral's main throne, and from that moment on, he was the law. And his orders were, basically, for everyone to go completely crazy. Imagine the visual scene, because it is worthy of a fever nightmare. The priests entered the choir to sing the divine office, but they weren't wearing their usual robes. They were in costume. Some dressed as women, others in filthy beggar's rags, and many wore masks. But forget beautiful Venetian carnival masks. We are talking about monstrous masks with deformed faces, animal snouts, horns, and warts. The aesthetic idea was to be as grotesque as possible. And there, in the middle of the nave, where normally only perfect chants were heard, these masked priests started howling like wolves, barking like dogs, and singing out of tune on purpose, turning the liturgy into an infernal parody. But the auditory chaos was just the beginning. What they did physically was even worse. While the fake bishop gave his ridiculous blessing, the rest of the young clergy turned the high altar into a tavern. Yes, the same stone altar where the miracle of transubstantiation occurs was used as a banquet table. They brought out greasy sausages, meat, and wine, eating right there on the holy cloth. They drank until they collapsed and played dice on the altar stone, gambling money right in front of the cross. And if you thought that was the limit, wait until you hear about the incense. Instead of aromatic grains, they stuffed the silver censers with old shoes, rotten leather, and even dried manure. They lit them and walked through the church, filling the air with a black, stinking smoke that made everyone cough. It was total inversion. The sacred became profane, the beautiful became ugly, and the smell of holiness became the stench of burning trash. The townspeople didn't stay outside. The cathedral filled with men and women dancing and jumping, joining the madness. They brought drums and tambourines, organizing obscene dances in the aisles. It was a total release of repressed instincts. The only day you could laugh in the bishop's face and behave like an animal without ceasing to be a Christian. Why did the church permit this? Theologians argued that madness was like steam in a pressure cooker. If you don't let the steam out once in a while, the pot explodes. They believed that if they constantly repressed man's instincts, society would erupt in real violence. So they preferred this controlled safety valve. Let them act like fools once a year so that for the rest of the time they remain docile. A brilliant paradox where chaos served order. But of course, the party eventually got out of hand. What started as symbolic fun became wilder and more dangerous. And right here, at the peak of the madness, we pause for a moment before seeing how they tried to stop this beast. We left our cathedral transformed into a veritable human zoo. We had priests disguised in demon masks, the high altar piled with sausages and wine, and a foul stench of burning shoes clouding the view of the saints in the stained glass windows. But if you thought the madness stopped at just eating and drinking, you are completely wrong. The Feast of Fools had layers upon layers of absurdity that went much further, evolving into rituals that today would seem not just blasphemous to us, but downright surreal. One of the most famous and visually striking variants that used to occur within this same festive cycle was the so-called Festum Asinorum, or the Feast of the Ass. I want you to visualize this calmly because it is a powerful image. In cities like Beauvais or Sens in France, the main ceremony wasn't just presided over by the fake Bishop of Fools. The absolute protagonist was a donkey. Yes, a real four-legged donkey. But not just any donkey pulled from a dirty stable at the last minute. They chose the most docile animal, covered it with a cape of gold and silk as if it were a king, and marched it solemnly through the main door of the cathedral. Imagine the sound of the animal's hooves striking the cold stone of the central nave, echoing in the temple's perfect acoustics. The procession advanced toward the altar, and the donkey was received not with mocking laughter, but with total comic seriousness. They placed it right next to the high altar. And here comes the incredible part. During the special mass they celebrated, every time the priest finished a prayer or a reading and the people were supposed to respond, Amen or Deo gratias, it was forbidden to use human words. The strict rule was that the entire congregation, hundreds of people, including the most serious clergy, had to bray. Imagine a choir of hundreds of throats going, hee-haw, hee-haw, in unison under the Gothic vault. The priest himself at the end of the Mass, instead of saying, Ite missa est, go in peace, would let out 3 loud, powerful brays to dismiss the faithful.
It was a Dadaist performance centuries before modern art even existed. But wait, there is a visual detail I haven't told you about that makes all this even more disturbing. The role reversal wasn't just about power, it was total. One of the most common sights in these processions was burly, hairy priests dressed as nuns or court ladies with exaggerated, vulgar makeup painted over their dirty faces. They would climb onto wooden carts dragged through the city and deliver what they called joyous sermons, or sermons joyeux. Basically, these were speeches full of dirty jokes, political satire, and mockery of local nobles, delivered with the same solemn tone and liturgical cadence they would use to read the Holy Gospel. Imagine the mental shock for a medieval peasant, seeing his parish priest dressed as a woman, shouting obscenities from a cart while the crowd threw ash and flour in his face. Because that was another custom. People ran after them throwing bran, dust, or trash, turning the cobblestone streets into a cloud of unbreathable filth where no one could recognize anyone. It was a dirty carnival where identity completely dissolved. But it wasn't all innocent laughter and friendly braying. As I hinted before, when you give free rein to chaos, chaos tends to bite back. The line between a joke and violence is very thin, and in the Middle Ages, that line was crossed constantly. What started as a parody of the ecclesiastical hierarchy sometimes turned into a real settling of scores. Remember that there were many accumulated tensions between the lower clergy, the poor, the hard workers, and the higher clergy, the rich, those living the good life. The festival gave them permission to mock, yes, but sometimes the mockery stung too much.
There are real chronicles that narrate how, in some cathedrals, the processions of fools ended in pitched battles. Buckets of dirty water were thrown at superiors who tried to restore order. In some documented cases, the joke of smoking them out with old shoes turned into throwing stones or rotten fruit at the homes of the city's most hated canons. There were years when blood literally stained the church floors. Cases were reported of stabbings among drunken clerics arguing over who should carry the Bishop of Fools' staff. The festival, designed to release tension, sometimes generated more tension than it released. The cathedral ceased to be a temple and became a dangerous tavern where God had gone out for a walk and left the children home alone. And here arises the great historical question: how on earth did this last so long? How is it possible that the Pope, the councils, and the kings allowed this mess for centuries? Because we are talking about a tradition that didn't last 2 days. It lasted hundreds of years, deeply rooted in France, in parts of Germany, in England, and even in some areas of Spain. The answer is that they did try to ban it. Boy, did they try. Since the 12th century, we start seeing furious letters from bishops and papal decrees, like those of Pope Innocent III, basically screaming, "Stop this madness now!" But custom, my friends, has a force that written law cannot easily topple. Every time an order arrived from Rome banning the party, the local clergy, those same subdeacons who needed their safety valve, found a way to ignore it, soften it, or change its name to keep celebrating it. There was an intellectual defense of the festival that is fascinating and deserves to be explained. In 1444, when the Faculty of Theology of Paris, The Sorbonne of the time, the intellectual elite, launched a harsh letter criticizing the festival. The defenders of the tradition responded with a metaphor that has gone down in history and perfectly sums up the medieval mindset. They said something like, "We are like old wine barrels. If the wine ferments and we don't open the bung once in a while to let the air out, the barrel bursts. We are ill-made old barrels that would burst with the wine of wisdom if this air of madness were not let out on certain days. Let us play the fool so that we may be wise the rest of the year." It's brilliant, isn't it? They used human nature itself to justify sacrilege. However, as we approach the end of the Middle Ages and enter the Renaissance, in the 15th and 16th centuries, the atmosphere in Europe began to change radically. The church was no longer in the mood for jokes. Why? Because real enemies appeared. The Protestant Reformation emerged. Luther and his followers started pointing fingers at the Catholic Church, saying, "Look at them. Look how corrupt they are. Look how they turn God's house into a circus." Suddenly, the Feast of Fools stopped being a funny, internal tradition and became a public embarrassment, ammunition for the church's enemies. Protestants used these festivals as proof that Catholicism was rotten. And the Catholic Church's reaction, in its Counter-Reformation, was to become much more serious, much stricter, and much more boring. There was no longer room for humor. The Council of Basel in 1431 had already raised an outcry, but it was the shift in mentality of the 16th century that delivered the final blow. Little by little, ecclesiastical authorities strangled the festival. They started imposing huge fines. They began threatening real excommunication, which at that time was like civil death, to anyone who participated. In some cities, the festival transformed. They pushed the madness out of the church interior and into the market square. And so, gradually, the religious festum fatuorum was diluted and blended with the profane carnival we know today. It went from being an inverted sacred rite at the altar to being a costume party in the street. By the time we reached the 17th century, the Feast of Fools had practically disappeared from European cathedrals. Solemn silence, order, and boring political correctness had won the battle. The reality was the smell of blood and wine mixed on the stone floor. It was the sound of braying bouncing off sacred walls. It was the image of a man of God wearing a demon mask, looking in the mirror, and not quite knowing where the saint ended and the monster began. So, the next time you walk into an ancient cathedral, when you are standing there in silence, looking up with respect and speaking in whispers, do me a favor. Try to listen for the echoes of the past. Imagine that in that very spot where you are now taking photos with your phone, 700 years ago, there was a donkey eating hay next to the tabernacle, and a fake bishop throwing sausages to the crowd. Remember that human history is not just order and progress. It is also chaos, laughter, and a desperate need to go crazy once in a while in order to stay sane. That was the forbidden Christmas of the Middle Ages. A fascinating reminder that, even in the darkest and most repressive times, human beings always find a crack through which to let their true nature escape. And maybe, just maybe, we should ask ourselves, where is our Feast of Fools today? Where is our safety valve? Because the pressure cooker is still there, and the steam always needs to get out.